and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. Summer 1911. In a remote area of Northern California, an Indian, in hiding for 40 years, walks out of the Stone Age and into modern civilization. This intriguing survivor, the last of his tribe, will have a profound impact on all those who meet him. Is he the key to understanding a vanishing way of life, or just a carnival sideshow exploited by the white man? The questions and controversies surrounding this mysterious figure as we go in search of Ishi, last of his kind. In the year 1911, America is at the center of a global industrial revolution. The nation has thrust itself into the 20th century with a burst of mechanical genius that invents the electric light, mass-produces automobiles, pioneers flight, and builds skyscrapers. America is in the business of manufacturing the most prized commodity of all, the future. But progress comes with a price. To make way for the teeming cities, the once seemingly endless frontier must be tamed. Caught in the sweep of this massive social change are the Indians who once freely roamed the plains. Those who haven't already gone the way of the buffalo are forced to either relocate to reservations or to assimilate into modern society. By 1911, the only places most Americans can see Indians are at Wild West shows or at movie theaters, where silent melodramas often portray them as noble savages. No longer are Indians seen as fearsome obstacles to manifest destiny. Now they are viewed as tragic figures symbolizing a bygone era. The disappearance of native populations during this era of advancing technology motivates social scientists to create a new field, anthropology, devoted to the study and preservation of man's myriad cultures. Practitioners of this new discipline are called salvage anthropologists. They believe their mission is to salvage and record the ancient ways of the first Americans. Among them is Alfred Kroeber, the first professor of the new anthropology department at the University of California at Berkeley.
Alfred Kroeber became the director of the first museum of anthropology west of the Mississippi River. Now, he wanted to build an institution that was as big as the Smithsonian, and he wanted to do that here in California and study Western cultures, Indian cultures, like they'd never been studied before.
What Kroeber seeks above all else is an Indian whom he describes as uncontaminated.
The reason that people like Kroeber were looking for the uncontaminated Native American was that they wanted to know for sure that what they were recording was based on strictly a Native American point of view and not influenced by having had contact with ranchers or other kinds of people.
In the summer of 1911, Kroeber finally gets his wish. A man emerges from the wild and walks into modern civilization. He will prove to be the lone survivor of a once elusive tribe. The man's wanderings have led him to a slaughterhouse outside the town of Oroville, California, perhaps to seek food or shelter. When startled employees find him crouched in a corner, they cover his naked and emaciated body with a canvas smock and phone the sheriff, informing him that they have something out there, but don't know what it is. The sheriff isn't sure either. For the sake of public safety, he locks the unusual-looking man in a jail cell until the Bureau of Indian Affairs determines what to do with him.
I imagine he was scared to death at this point. Given that he had made the decision to do this, maybe he thought that he was already dead. Maybe he was in an afterlife situation. It's hard to tell.
In the sheriff's office, a curious crowd gathers around a cell usually reserved for the insane, watching the ravenous Indian devour a meal of beans and donuts. The onlookers wonder aloud, who is this primitive stranger and where does he come from? In the quest for answers, the sheriff calls in local assimilated Indians and even Chinese residents to speak in their native tongues with the man who will soon be known as Ishi.
When Ishi came out in 1911, there weren't any wild Indians living in North America. Most of the Indian people had been assimilated into boarding schools, put on the reservations, or forced into some kind of normal labor. People were not living the old traditional ways. Ishi was the last.
This last wild Indian cannot communicate with his captors through words. Only through pantomime can he tell his story. Gesturing with his fingers, he indicates that he comes from up north. He was with 3 others, but 2 had drowned, and the other was partially eaten by coyotes. Ishi's hair is singed close in mourning for his lost companions, a common Northern California Indian ritual. Finally, pointing to himself, he indicates that he is alone and the last of his people. Ishi's story spreads quickly, mostly through sensational news stories that describe the polite, friendly Indian as a savage, Stone Age wild man. This incredible story reaches Professor Kroeber at Berkeley, who recalls an earlier sighting of a people like Ishi in the same area in 1908. Could the wild man of Oroville have come from that area? If so, how did he manage to survive? Kroeber sends his colleague, T.T. Waterman, to Oroville to investigate.
Waterman was very different from Kroeber. Kroeber was the epitome of a scientist, the man who stands back and looks at people from a distance and studies them and calculatingly writes everything down. Where Waterman was a man who might go out drinking with the boys, a man who was also a scientist and who took his work very seriously, but at the same time could get out in the field and have a good time with people.
When Waterman arrives in Ishi's jail cell, he reads a list of words from various tribal languages to determine which one the Indian spoke. For a long time, the two struggle to communicate, until Waterman speaks a word in the Yona dialect.
An agreement was finally reached on the word for which his cot was made, sawini, or yellow pine. His face lightened up at this word, though he evidently could hardly trust his senses. These were probably the first intelligible sounds he had heard from a human being in 3 years.
Waterman sends for an interpreter, Sam Botwe, an assimilated northern Yawni living nearby in the town of Redding. But hope for a warm meeting between the two distantly related tribesmen is dashed.
Ishi was put off by Sam Botwe because when he first met him, Sam presented himself as being part of the white culture, and he sort of lorded himself over on Ishi. And so all that came across to Ishi. I mean, Ishi didn't consider himself inferior to anybody. He felt good about himself. He felt good about his culture.
After a brief, strained conversation, Botwe determines that Ishi is from a tiny band of the southern Yona called Yahi, a group about whom little was known. With such an unlikely pedigree, Ishi is the uncontaminated Indian for whom Kroeber has long been searching. Kroeber immediately secures permission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to bring Ishi to San Francisco for study. Preparing to board the train to San Francisco, Ishi looks like a man caught between two worlds. He wears a white man's shirt, jacket, and pants, but his feet are bare, still unaccustomed to the constraints of shoes. Waterman, who stood protectively by his side, later recalls Ishi's first reaction to the approaching train.
As number 5 appeared in the distance, Ishi wanted to hide behind something. He had seen trains wandering by in the distance, but he had not known that they ran on tracks. He visualized a train as some devil-driven, inhuman prodigy.
In an ancient Yahi tale known as the Journey of the Dead, one spirit upon death travels south looking for an entrance to the other world. The spirit either burrows underground or takes wing and soars through the sky. Just 1 week after his appearance in Oroville, Ishi, the last Yahi, will embark on a journey south like none his people had ever taken, and will enter another world stranger than they could have imagined. On Labor Day 1911, Ishi, the savage Stone Age wild man, arrives in San Francisco. Immediately, vaudeville promoters besiege his chaperone, anthropologist T.T. Waterman, with offers as high as $2,000 just to put the Indian on stage. Waterman firmly declines. Finding the Indian is a breakthrough for science, not show business, a point Professor Kroeber emphasizes at the press conference.
The capture of this man is of the utmost importance. He represents a new and supposedly extinct dialect. He is more of an aborigine than any of the Indians we have been working with for 10 years. He knows nothing of the whites.
The reporters shower Kroeber with questions demanding to know the Indian's name.
A lot of Indians are really reticent about giving their personal names, particularly to anybody outside their own group. These were people that were not part of Yahi culture, and so he would have been reticent to have provided his name simply because that's not what they did.
The Indian never does reveal his real name, but begins to respond to the one Kroeber has given him, Ishi, the Yahi word for man. The naming begins an unlikely friendship between intellectual and aborigine.
Ishi and Alfred Kroeber are a very unique pair of people. Opposites, you might say. A German from New York, a scientist, and an Indian man from Northern California raised in a traditional environment. How opposites you could get, yet at the same time there was an incredible respect and appreciation for each other and what they could share and what they could learn from each other.
Under Kroeber's watchful eye, Ishi acclimates quickly to his new world. During his first day at the museum, photographers request that he pose in animal skins. Ishi, who has spent most of his life wearing little, if any, garments, declines. His reason, as expressed through his interpreter Sam Botwe, is that no one else in the room is dressed that way. In the following days, Kroeber notes that Ishi's most common facial expression is the raising of his eyebrows each time he encounters something new. They arch in amazement at everything from penny whistles and safety pins to typewriters and electric lights. The proper way to raise a window shade is a puzzle. Getting water from a faucet a pleasure, and transportation a miracle. He prefers streetcars to automobiles. They're bigger and have bells. When Ishi first sees an airplane in flight, he asks if a white man is in it. When he learns that there is, he just laughs. Ishi is impressed by these modern conveniences, but he isn't fooled by them. The white man is clever, but not wise, he observes.
I think Ishi looked at the white man as not being in tune with the natural world, that they altered stuff, they destroyed things, they did not try to work with nature, they basically tried to conquer nature. And I think a lot of Native Americans have that same point of view.
What amazes Ishi most about San Francisco is the sheer number of people. At a city beach, thousands of sunbathers astonish him more than the vastness of the ocean. Hansi Soltu, he exclaims, many white people. Those same crowds come to see Ishi at the museum, where Kroeber has given him a room surrounded by exhibits of Indian artifacts. Every Sunday afternoon, Ishi gives demonstrations, showing visitors how to build a shelter, make a fire, and chip arrowheads from seltzer bottles, which he gives away as souvenirs. He soon becomes the museum's most popular attraction, drawing nearly 24,000 people his first 6 months there.
People find it very odd that he lived at the museum and try to see him as a specimen, but they actually had some residential rooms that a number of people lived in the museum. And what they did is they gave Ishi a niche in this society that he could fit in and be comfortable in, just like if you or I go to live among Indians today, they will find you a niche that's comfortable. And so I think Ishi saw them as doing the same thing for him, being hospitable, that he would have done for them.
Though comfortable living within the confines of the museum, Ishi's constant exposure to the crowds takes its toll. After only a few months, he contracts pneumonia. Waterman briefly considers placing him in a glass enclosure to satisfy the public demand to see him, but rejects the idea. Ishi recovers from his illness under the care of Saxton Pope, a doctor at the University Hospital, and a man with whom Ishi will develop a deep and lasting bond.
Pope had been raised in South Texas. His father was an Army surgeon. He had seen Indians only as enemies and somebody to be fighting with. When he met Ishi, he found somebody that he could be a friend with and somebody that he could really respect. Ishi taught him how to hunt with a bow and arrow, and Pope loved it. And they would keep score of who won each one of these shooting contests. And amazingly, Ishi never won. Ishi was used to shooting at real targets, at real animals with a sharp bow. Ishi must have been very much amused by this idea of shooting competitively, the bow and arrow.
Pope invites Ishi to accompany him on his hospital rounds. He marvels at the Indian's naturally compassionate bedside manner.
His affability and pleasant disposition made him a universal favorite. He visited the sick in the wards with a gentle and sympathetic look which spoke more clearly than words. He would go from bed to bed like a visiting physician, looking at each patient with quiet concern or a fleeting smile that was very kindly received and understood.
Ishi's receptiveness to his new world contrasts sharply with his reticence to reveal the secrets of his old one. Kroeber and Waterman implore him to speak about his family, the fate of his tribe, and the circumstances that brought him out of the wilderness, but Ishi persistently refuses to address these subjects.
Most Native Americans have a taboo against speaking of the dead, and the Yahi and Ishi particularly. If you spoke about the dead, it would bring their spirit back, which could be very dangerous and hazardous to your health. They could kill you. So that's a pretty good reason not to speak about the dead. It's very unfortunate for anthropology because he wouldn't speak about those people, at least directly.
Instead of speaking directly about his people, Ishi recites songs and stories about the Yahi way of life. Kroeber and Waterman record them on Edison wax cylinders, forerunners of audio cassettes and CDs.
We get a glimpse of Ishi's sense of humor when he starts telling the story of wood duck. It's a very humorous story about a courtship between a wood duck and these other animals. And Ishi would tell this story using the different voices of different animals and bringing whether it was coyote might have one voice, it might be another voice for wood duck, it might be another voice for the woodpecker. And Ishi would assume these voices almost like a cartoon.
Other stories are serious, offering instructions on how to make everything from arrows to acorn soup. Kroeber and Waterman managed to compile a vast collection of Yahi lore. Though they have difficulty understanding everything Ishi says, his stories give them a fleeting glimpse into his old world and an understanding of how he has adapted so well to his new one.
If you look at the songs and the stories that the Yahi tell, they're about a way to live a life. Everything has a logical order in his world, and that is the way he was raised. And everything he was taught made sense. And I think that gave Ishi a very strong foundation on which to make the transition from his world into ours.
By 1913, just 2 years after his arrival in San Francisco, Ishi has learned enough English to get by and can sign his name. His daily routine includes working as a museum janitor, riding the trolley on his own, and spending his free time in Golden Gate Park, observing animals and befriending children.
In the park, he played with children a lot, and I've met old people now who knew Ishi in the park when they were children who lived in that neighborhood and enjoyed him thoroughly.
Perhaps no one observes Ishi's evolution with more interest than T.T. Waterman. Their close friendship began the day they met in the Oroville jail, and Ishi becomes a regular house guest at the Waterman home.
Ishi saw the Waterman family as this nuclear family that he could actually come into and be this uncle or whatever, as a very positive thing for him, and it might have been one of the most important things in Ishi's life, which people don't pay a lot of attention to because there isn't a lot of information about it. But my take on it is that given that family is extremely important among hunter-gatherers, and Ishi didn't have that for a good part of his life, or for many years, I think he placed a lot of value on that relationship with the Waterman family.
Ishi's warmth, good manners, and tidy appearance inspire Waterman to comment.
He convinced me that there is such a thing as gentlemanliness, which lies outside of all training. It is an expression purely of inward spirit. He had an inborn considerateness that surpassed in fineness all of the civilized breeding with which I am familiar.
In 1913, the Bureau of Indian Affairs gives Ishi a choice: go back to the wild or join other Indians on a reservation. Ishi chooses neither. "I will live like the white people from now on," he says, speaking through interpreter Sam Botwe. "I want to stay where I am. I will grow old here and die in this house."
Ishi decided to stay in San Francisco. He felt he was at home. There were people that cared about him. If you look at his photos, you see him smiling, you see him happy, you see him with other people enjoying their company. And that's very Indian. Indian people like to be around other people. They like to share things. They're not hermits.
Ishi's future clearly lies in San Francisco, but his past remains shrouded in mystery. Though he continues to refuse to talk about what happened to his tribe, Professor Kroeber uncovers several eyewitness accounts of the Yahi's demise in the historical record. They are enough to piece together much of the bloody history of Ishi's people. At their peak, the Yahi numbered about 400 and lived along Mill Creek in the foothills of Mount Lassen, a volcanic mountain. They were as rugged as the land and defended it with a ferocity that intimidated neighboring tribes.
That was one of the defining characteristics of Yahi culture, is that they were very aggressive. They had the I don't know, you might say the Napoleon syndrome. They were small and they were very aggressive.
This aggressiveness led to their doom when they encountered their most militant foe, the white man. He came in droves through Indian country during the gold rush of 1849.
One of the things that to me is so dismaying about California's gold rush history is that the violence done against the Indians of California during the gold rush, and there was a massive amount of violence, in fact there was an orgy of violence, was done at the hands of militia. State troops, miners' militias, and vigilante groups that went out and hunted and killed Indians without remorse.
While other tribes capitulated, the Yahis fought back. What they used to hunt, they now had to steal. Soon they became the hunted. Even acorn gathering became an act of life and death as it exposed the Yahi to white attack. In this hostile atmosphere, Ishi was born in the early 1850s, a time when it was not only legal to hunt Indians in California, but highly profitable.
The California state government back in those days was paying so much money for each scalp, and if you brought the whole head in, you got even more money. And then they were reimbursed by the federal government. And so one period of time in there, California paid more than $1.5 million for Indian scalps.
In spite of this genocidal policy, Ishi's people would not be taken easily. Adept at guerrilla warfare, they drove off cattle and destroyed property, avenging the atrocities against them. When innocent women and children were found dead, local whites took decisive action. They raised $3,000 to fund vigilantes who vowed to exterminate the Yahi. Robert Anderson, the sheriff of Butte County, and Hiram Good, who at one time had 40 Indian scalps hanging from a tree in his front yard, led the death squad. Beginning in 1865, they massacred the Yahi on 5 separate occasions, killing up to 40 Indians each time. During one of these incidents, Ishi, then a boy, and a woman presumed to be his mother, jumped into a creek and floated past dead family members to safety. The Yahi tried to surrender, ceremoniously offering a friendly rancher 5 bows, but were scared off by a ranch hand whom they mistook for a vigilante. The reign of violence culminated at Kingsley Cave in 1871. There, 30 Yahi were killed in cold blood at close range. One vigilante could not bear to kill the children with a rifle. It tore them up bad, he said. Instead, he shot them with a revolver. After this last attack, the vigilantes considered the Yahi all but extinct. A few, perhaps as many as a dozen, managed to survive. Among them, Ishi, then about 10 years old. They retreated into the rugged terrain around Deer Creek and were rarely seen again.
Ishi's life in hiding was very different from what it was before. In the past, they lived along the rivers. They lived out openly. Well, they could no longer do that in hiding. They had to exist on small amount of resources in a very confined area.
That confined area, measuring no more than 2 miles long and a half-mile wide, featured a rocky cliff overlooking the Sacramento Valley. The Yahi called it Bear's Hiding Place. There, Ishi and his fellow survivors skillfully avoided detection.
I mean, they were hiding right there under the noses of everybody. They built rock walls, put up posts, and probably stretched deer hides and stuff so you could hide fires. They had cracks in the ceiling so the smoke would get trapped in the ceiling of the cave instead of going out into the open.
Ishi and the others eked out an existence, taking whatever they needed to survive from surrounding ranches. Glass from bottles and windows replaced obsidian for arrowheads. Guns were not used as weapons, but rather dismantled and their parts used for tools. They lived like this for nearly 40 years, their numbers slowly dwindling until only Ishi remained. Ishi and a small number of Yahi Indians hid so well that most whites believed them to be extinct. Until 1908, when a group of Oroville Power Company surveyors came upon the Yahi camp and took their tools and other belongings.
The sad thing for the Yahi was that this was in November, which was toward the very end of the fall when they needed to gather as much food for overwintering Now, the Oroville Power and Light people didn't know this, but these very important tools that they had, such as grinding stones, bows and arrows, baskets for collecting, all that stuff was taken away. And that probably was the first step causing the final demise of the Yahi.
In 1914, anxious to see how Ishi lived in his own environment, Kroeber asks the Indian to take him to Deer Creek, the Yahi's last refuge. But Ishi protests. There are no chairs, houses, or beds there, he argues. These are excuses, not the real reason.
There were dead people living in Deer Creek that were his ancestors, and that's very dangerous. It almost seems like the Yahi, or Ishi, had a similar feeling about the dead that the Navajo do. You just stay completely away from the dead.
After 3 years in civilization, Ishi is persuaded to make the journey. In the spring of 1914, he, Kroeber, Waterman, and Dr. Saxton Pope and his son head out for Deer Creek. Their guide, Merle Apperson, had been with the Oroville Power Company surveyors when they happened on the Yahi in 1908. Apperson shows Kroeber the artifacts he stole from the Yahi campsite.
Kroeber stopped and said, "I will give you any amount of money to buy that material," because he wanted to bring it back with Ishi to the museum. And he did sell it, and we now have it in the museum. A lot of those objects that were stolen and might have caused the final demise of the Yahi. There is no written record of Ishi's reaction to that. We don't know. We don't know how he reacted to that at all.
As the Kroeber party approaches Deer Creek, Ishi grows uneasy. Dr. Pope's son, Saxton Pope Jr., notes the change in his behavior.
Ishi was worried that the spirits of his lost relatives would still be roaming over the land. He said the voice of his sister was calling him. One night, Ishi slipped away and disappeared into the brush. When he came back, he told me his people were not lost, that they had found their way. After that night, Ishi seemed relaxed and content to be back in his country.
In Yahi country, Ishi is the master and the others merely students. He shows them Bear's hiding place and explains how he'd lived in hiding. He fishes with a harpoon. He hunts with a bow and arrow. When Ishi can't find a deer, he blames it on Pope for smoking and requests that he stop. Pope acquiesces, and Ishi gets his deer. He skins and butchers the animal as the Yahi have done for generations. To relax, they all swim in the cooling waters of Deer Creek. The trip proves vital to both Ishi and Kroeber. Kroeber is now able to compile a unique ethnographic record of how the Yahi had lived. Ishi tells him more than 200 place names and 100 plants for food and medicine. The trip is also vital for Ishi. It is the first time in his life he is at peace in his own land. Dr. Saxton Pope observed the effect that had on him.
In 1914, we see him at his best. On his trip, he was undoubtedly in prime health. His stature is magnificent. There is grace and strength in every contour. He was absolutely perfect. He worked, hunted, played, and enjoyed life.
After a 4-week trip, the group returns to San Francisco, where in 1915, Kroeber convinces Edward Sapir, a brilliant linguist from the Canadian Geological Survey, to work with Ishi and translate the stories the anthropologists still can't understand.
For 4 years, they had suffered through a lot of difficulty in communicating with him, to the point that they really could not understand some of his stories at all, or could just barely understand them. And when Sapir came, that was somebody that Ishi could talk to, who could understand his language, and could understand some of the complicated concepts that he was trying to communicate. And I'm sure that it was a lot of fun for Ishi to do that.
Sapir writes down Ishi's every word and gesture as he acts out his stories. It is an exhausting, time-consuming, and difficult process. In August, after 3 months of intensive work, Ishi collapses.
There's a real poignant point in the notebooks where, as they went through, they wrote down the story and then they did some translation, and at a certain point the analysis or translation breaks off, stops, and that's the day that Ishi went to the hospital in San Francisco.
Ishi is diagnosed with tuberculosis. Ishi had survived genocidal attacks by vigilantes and a long, perilous existence in hiding. But neither experience had prepared him for his toughest challenge, battling tuberculosis. At the peak of his illness, he is placed in the care of his good friend, Dr. Saxton Pope.
At the period when he seemed to be failing so rapidly that the end may be near, I coaxed him to get out of bed and let me take his picture once more. He was always happy to be photographed and accommodated me. It was only after the picture was developed that I realized to what a pitiful condition he had been reduced. Had this been apparent before, I should not have asked this exertion of him.
Professor Kroeber, in Europe on sabbatical, receives word of Ishi's imminent death. Worried that Pope will perform an autopsy on Ishi, a violation of a Yahi spiritual belief, Kroeber urgently writes Waterman, expressing rare emotion.
As to the disposal of the body, I must ask you, as my personal representative on the spot in this matter, to yield nothing at all under the circumstances. If there is any talk about the interests of science, then say for me that science can go to hell. We propose to stand by our friends.
When he becomes too weak to talk, Ishi communicates to Pope in hand gestures. You stay here. I go ahead. On March 25, 1916, Ishi dies. An autopsy is performed, and Ishi's brain is removed. Kroeber's letter arrives too late. Together, Waterman and Pope accompany the body to a cemetery near San Francisco, where it is cremated. Ishi's ashes rest there still, in a small Indian pottery jar. Ishi's death deeply affected all of his friends. Saxton Pope, inspired by Ishi, went on to become the father of modern archery. For years, T.T. Waterman struggled with the guilt he felt for pushing Ishi too hard in his last year. Dr. Kroeber was never the same. Of the many Indians he studied, Ishi was the only one with whom he ever became close. Soon after Ishi died, the professor began to question his choice of anthropology as a career, and in his confusion, entered psychoanalysis. Only on rare occasions did he ever speak of Ishi.
He was industrious, kindly obliging, invariably even-tempered, ready of smile, and thoroughly endeared himself to all with whom he came into contact. With his death, the Yahi were no more.
I think Ishi's main legacy is that he stands to challenge our stereotypes of indigenous people in North America. He's made us appreciate American Indians in a new way.
I think as a Native American myself and others feel that he's sort of the example of everything that went wrong in terms of the prejudices faced by 19th century California Indians. Ishi is sort of the poster boy for the abuse of science and human experiments.
Ishi had a sense of balance about the world, where he saw that everything had its place. He dealt with strange things by laughing at them. And I think we can all learn to laugh at the world and be a little bit healthier.
In February 1999, researchers from the University of San Francisco finally solved the mystery of the disappearance of Ishi's brain. After a 2-year search, they located the preserved organ in a warehouse at the Smithsonian Institution. Northern California Native Americans plan to give Ishi's remains a proper burial. The quiet Yahi man whom the anthropologists called Ishi had a profound impact on everyone who knew him. From the moment he appeared, naked, hungry, and shivering in that slaughterhouse in Oroville, he became a teacher whose lessons are etched in the language of the heart. What makes a person civilized is not his sophistication, but his spirit. A spirit that made Ishi the last of a kind, a first among men. An inspiration to us all as we go in search of history.